Thank you all for attending on behalf of the American Security Project. Just a little bit about ASP. It's a nonpartisan organization created to educate the American public and the world about the changing nature of security in the 21st century. Our founders included now Secretary of State Kerry and Secretary of Defense Hagel. So we've got a pretty good lineage of people with competency and experience in security. I think gone are the days when a nation's security could be measured by bombers and battleships. Security in the new era requires harnessing all of America's strength. The force of our diplomacy, the vigor of our military, the competitiveness of our economy, but I think most of all, the power of our ideals. We believe that America must lead in the pursuit of our common goals and shared security. We must confront international challenges with our partners and with all the tools at our disposal and address emerging problems before they become security crises. We live in a time when the threats to our security are as complex and as diverse as terrorism, nuclear proliferation, climate change, and I might say that Steve Cheney, who's usually opening these events, has been down appearing on the Weather Channel and other media outlets in connection with the release of the Climate Security Report yesterday. ASP exists to promote the dialogue, to forge the consensus, and to spur constructive action so that America can meet the challenges we face. Today, the title of our conference is the 21st Century U.S. Egypt Strategic Relations. And let me thank a couple of people who've made great effort in putting this on. Amar Badr and Basil Elbaz. Thank you very much for what you've done in supporting this effort. Egypt is the most populous and traditionally one of the most influential countries in the Middle East. The United States has had a long-term military, cultural, and economic connection with that country. In fact, I've spent most of my career as a Marine Corps officer deploying to the Mediterranean and being involved in security issues around the littoral of the Med, including North Africa. And the relationship, particularly that our military has built over those years, continues to hold us in good stead as we go through rough times. In addition to the relationship with the U.S., Egypt merits the attention and concern of all nations due to its natural position as a leader in the Middle East and Africa, its counter-terrorism efforts, the importance of securing its borders, the Suez Canal, and other key positions on both the Red Sea and the Mediterranean. We will have 3 panel discussions today. The first one will be led by Lara Jakes. She's an award-winning correspondent for the Associated Press here in Washington. She is currently the national security writer and is based at the State Department. Lara worked for 3 years as a foreign correspondent based in Iraq, including 1 year as AP's chief of bureau in Baghdad. She has covered war and sectarian fighting in Iraq, Afghanistan, the West Bank, and Northern Ireland. Jakes was a Homeland Security Fellow at the Knight Center for Specialized Journalism at the University of Maryland. She is a 1995 graduate of the University of Missouri School of Journalism. You know, as being from Tennessee and a part of the Southeast Conference, that was one of the worst mistakes that we ever made, was allowing Missouri into the Southeast Conference.
M-I-Z.
Yeah. Go Vols. Lara, I turn it over to you now for your panel. Thank you very much.
Thank you. This morning, I had the opportunity to be among a small group of journalists who interviewed His Excellency Amr Moussa on his thoughts on where Egypt is going. You'll hear from him yourself shortly, and I'm sure he'll convey to you what he told us, that Egypt is turning a new page. And I have to wonder, is it one that the international community, or even Egyptians themselves, will want to read? In the last several months, we have seen death sentences in absentia, continued detention of journalists, the branding of people who affiliate themselves with the Muslim Brotherhood as terrorists, without acknowledging that many are not violent. Mr. Moussa expressed some frustration himself with some of Egypt's current laws that do not seem democratic on the surface, particularly those to do with the courts and with press freedoms. And he raised the possibility that some of those might be changed after parliamentary elections that I believe are scheduled for this June. But as for the presidential elections later this month, as you know, it is widely expected that former Army Chief General Abdel Fattah al-Sisi will win. How he will rule and whether it will be accepted by the Egyptian people is an open question. If there is strong turnout in a fair and transparent election, and if al-Sisi wins by a large margin, this would signal another definite rejection of the Muslim Brotherhood, and it would give a legitimacy that would enable the United States government to normalize its relationship with a democratically elected government. But that's a lot of ifs, and this by no means is assured. The U.S. remains wary for two reasons especially. The Obama administration got burned over the last few years by uncomfortably trying to establish a relationship with President Mohamed Morsi. And his ouster looked like, smelled like, and sounded very much like a coup, even if the White House doesn't want to admit it. So now, as you know, there is huge reluctance in Washington to approve up to $1.5 billion in U.S. aid to Egypt. Even the nearly $700 million in military aid that the State Department approved last month is now being held up by Congress as questions remain about Egypt's commitment to democracy and rule of law. But if the U.S. won't play, someone else will. Egyptian officials are finding assistance elsewhere, notably from the Emiratis and from Russia. And this, of course, raises all sorts of questions about with whom Egypt might ally as the U.S. tries to quell other conflicts around the world, including Syria and Ukraine. So, as we have seen in recent visits to Washington by Mr. Moussa and Foreign Minister Nabil Fahmy, Egypt is on a pre-election charm offensive to lay the groundwork for a better relationship with the U.S. going forward. And it might be asked whether the U.S. is doing more or should be doing more on its own to reciprocate. I'll stop there to introduce our distinguished panel and to ask them to say a few words on where they see this relationship is going. And after that, I'll start off the Q&A with a few questions on my own and then open it to the audience. I'm sure many of you know this distinguished panel already, but we start with Senator Norm Coleman, a senior government advisor at Logan Lovells, he'll clarify that for you. He counsels clients on a wide range of regulatory and government affairs issues. He served as a U.S. Senator from Minnesota from 2003 to 2009. Prior to his election to the U.S. Senate, he was mayor of St. Paul, Minnesota from 1994 to 2002. During his 6 years in the Senate, Senator Coleman served on the Foreign Relations Committee. He was chair of the Western Hemisphere Subcommittee and ranking member of the Near East Subcommittee, working to foster closer ties with our hemispheric neighbors and protect America's interests in the crucial Middle East region. Senator Coleman also co-chaired the Senate Biofuels Caucus and served on the Senate Agriculture Committee. He currently serves as chairman of the board of the American Action Network here in Washington. Gamal Helal has been the senior Democratic interpreter for Presidents George H.W. Bush, President Clinton, President George W. Bush, and President Barack Obama, as well as numerous secretaries of state and defense and national security advisors. He has served as a senior advisor in the following capacities: Gulf security for the U.S. Department of State, Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. He was at the Bureau of Near Eastern Affairs at the State Department on Arab-Israeli negotiations and U.S. bilateral relations with the Arab world. He was also worked on the Middle East Special Coordinator for Arab-Israeli negotiations at the State Department and served as a member of President Clinton's team on Arab-Israeli negotiations. He has received several awards throughout his career, as well as recognition from the State Department and the White House, and was chosen by GQ magazine in September 2007 as one of the 50 most influential people in Washington, D.C. Now, how does one get on that list?
I don't know.
Congressman Jim Kolbe is currently serving as a senior transatlantic fellow at the German Marshall Fund in the United States and a senior advisor to McLarty Associates, a consulting firm here in Washington. Recently, President Obama appointed him to the Advisory Committee for Trade Policy and Negotiations, where he provides policy advice on trade matters. Congressman Kolbe is also a co-chair on Modernizing Foreign Assistance Network, which is a reform coalition composed of international development and foreign policy practitioners. For 22 years, he served in the House of Representatives. He was elected for 11 consecutive terms from 1985 to 2007. He represented the 8th Congressional District of Arizona, mostly, which is centered around Tucson, if you don't know. And while in Congress, he served on the Appropriations Committee and was chairman also of the Treasury, Post Office, and Related Agency Subcommittee for 4 years. So welcome to you all. Thank you so much for attending. I'm sure you will all provide for an amazing and educational perspective on what's happening.
Marriages have their ups and downs. We have our challenges. But there are some core values and things that hold us together, and certainly that's been the U.S.-Israel, U.S.-Egypt relationship. I say Israel because in part one of the centerpieces of American foreign policy in the Middle East is Egypt and Israel abiding by the 79 Peace Treaty. Critically important. Our warships need to get through the Suez Canal. We need to have overflights. There are going to be 2 other panels that are going to talk about the economic aspects of the relationship and the security aspect of the relationship. But they're both very critical, very critical. It's interesting because I share, I'm going to be very blunt here, I share the concerns that Laura mentioned about some of the activities on part of the judiciary in Egypt, some of the concerns, and I serve on the Board of National Endowment for Democracy, some of the actions involving NGOs. I share those concerns, they've got to be addressed. But I'm also going to say that I am unabashedly pro the new Egypt. Egypt suffered from terrible mismanagement, that's a mild term, under Morsi. Terrible. The economy suffered. The people of Egypt spoke up. They rose up. And so change was coming, and change is coming. And then there are question marks ultimately about the change. But the change, fundamentally at this point, there's no doubt that Egypt is in a better place today than it was under Morsi. And so I kind of lay that out. In part, by the way, one of the things the relationship requires is a bit more consistency even on our part. So we were for Mubarak before we were against, talking about the U.S. We were for Mubarak before we were against Mubarak. We were for and saw the MB, Muslim Brotherhood, as kind of the new movement in Islam, and we embraced it. At the time that the Egyptian people were rejecting it because of what they were dealing with. We were for the military in that we didn't call the actions of the military a coup, and the military would say we respond to the needs of the people. We didn't call it a coup, but the military is in charge. On the other hand, we're seen as not being in support of the military because we're cutting off aid. And we reinstitute the aid and we provide for the delivery of Apache helicopters. But then Senator Leahy just recently come back and has kind of reinstituted the policy of not forwarding aid. So I would say that one of the things that's required, and it's got to start at the White House level, the executive level, but Congress also has to play a part here. There needs to be a little more consistency in American foreign policy in terms of our attitude in working with Egypt. And I say that, and I understand, I've seen the flirtation with the Russians and of concern. In many ways, we, the United States, brought the Russians back into the equation, bringing them into the discussions in Syria. The Russians were out of the Middle East for a long time. And I also believe that the relationship that we have with Egypt, goes beyond just the hardware. There's a cultural attachment and ties of training decades of Egyptian officers, and a cultural thing that I think goes a lot deeper than simply the mechanics of particular weapons system. And so I think those ties are there. I think they're strong. I think Egypt, it's interesting, the cooperation between the Egyptians and the Israelis in terms of what's happening in the Sinai, and that is a huge issue. The issue of the Sinai, and again, the security panel will discuss it, but the activities of non-state networks, Al-Qaeda, terrorist networks in the Sinai is a major concern, and it's to stability in the region. Let me kind of pull it all together. The relationship is important. Egypt is important. largest Arab country. His Excellency Ambassador Musa will be here later. The strength of their diplomatic corps, both in international bodies and in the region. They are a player, an important player, and we have a mutually beneficial, mutually dependent relationship. Here's my fear, and I want to end it on this note. There was a story that ran in the New York Times last week. Headline was, "Military aid for Egyptians lose support in the Senate." Rand Paul is not alone on this issue. When folks like Lindsey Graham or Ileana Ross-Layton express concerns about aid, I think you got to take notice of that. And so, the test, Lara, that you mentioned of where Egypt goes after this presidential election is important. And by the way, it doesn't have to be U.S. democracy. Democracy takes a while. But rule of law, transparency, a path to democracy, I think we have a real stake in supporting that. I think Egypt has to do a better job of communicating that the commitment is real. And I think some of the, and you don't make a lot of friends when you see headlines about 600-something people sentenced to death. And so sensitivity on the part of our Egyptian friends in terms of what needs to be done to keep the relationship on a consistent path, a little more consistency in the United States part, a little more clarity in terms of why this relationship is important, and that we're going to be supportive. And the future is unknown, but as I said, Egypt's in a better place than it was before, and I think we should certainly be working with them as they move forward on this path to, quote, democracy.
Thank you. Gamal?
Okay. Thanks, Lara. Thanks, Senator. I'm going to try to be very short and very brief. Is that relationship important? I would say yes, it is very important. 25 years or so working with the U.S. government on the executive branch of the government and dealing with a variety of issues tells me that, yes, it is important, and this is not disputable. Why would one think that Egypt is important to the United States? I would say there are probably 4 major objectives why Egypt is important. Certainly one of them is a source of stability. When you look at the last 50 years or so, the last war that Egypt went through was 1973. Since then, it has been a source of stability. And I think, as Secretary Baker lately said in an interview, stability is not a dirty word in foreign policy. It is important, but it comes with particular guidelines, so stability will not become something else. But certainly it's one of the major objectives that it is important to advance U.S. interests. Another objective will be to advancing Arab-Israeli peace. If it wasn't for Egypt and late President Sadat's visit and establishing the Egyptian-Israeli peace agreement that was followed later on by Jordan and by Oslo, and created the process that still leaves room for Syria and Lebanon, it would have not happened. It would have been less likely that we would have seen a peace process and a peace agreement if it wasn't for Egypt's role. And we've seen that treaty was tested, really, in a very serious manner during the last 30-plus years. There were ups and downs, but nonetheless, it was able to sustain itself and actually work well for both countries. The third objective, I would say, counter-terrorism. Protecting the homeland does not start with the shores of New Jersey and New York and Maryland and the East Coast or the West Coast. Protecting the homeland and protecting the United States and its national security starts literally thousands of miles away. Cooperation between the United States and Egypt on counterintelligence, on counter-terrorism and intelligence sharing, I think it has proven to be very useful and very productive for the U.S. over the years. We've seen it when 9/11 took place, and we've seen it before and after that. And that is a national security issue that it is, I believe, important, at least to the 5 administrations that I work with. The third one is the military-to-military relationship. This is proven to be a very vital and useful relationship. We in the U.S. certainly enjoy some privileges out of this relationship. We have the the fast-track passage through the Suez Canal, and there's millions of dollars literally involved in this if ships do not have that privilege. We have the overall flight privileges. And we, in the U.S. side, we believe that this has proven to be very effective, either through our routine operations or when the U.S. Had to go to wars like Kuwait or Iraq. In addition to the normal movements of our naval assets in the Gulf that go back and forth, either through the Suez Canal, either to go to the Gulf or to the Indian Ocean. So I think these are four big objectives that are important basically to every administration when you look at it, because this is not a partisan issue. This is truly a bipartisan issue. For Egypt, I think also this relationship is important. It is important for Egypt to protect and maintain that relationship with the United States. They certainly, as Egypt becomes an emerging democracy, not a mature democracy by any stretch of imagination, I think Egyptians trying to figure out what is the best way forward and what will be the best approach. They have tried, for example, a year and a half ago, and they believe that this is not the right way to go. Now they're trying something else. The point is Egypt needs economic help. They need security help. They certainly need political help. And the United States will be in a position to provide that help to Egypt as they move forward. Egypt traditionally had to play a role regionally in the Middle East as well as in Africa. I think advancing its relationship with the United States will help Egypt recover fairly quickly in playing that role. Egypt has so many institutions that really needs to be rebuilt and rehabilitated. And over the years, through AID help and so on, we were able to help the Egyptians, Ministry of Education, Health, and so on, were able to benefit. But I think now, as Egypt chartered its own new pathway, there will be a great deal of need for that help. The fourth objective, I think, for Egypt will be maintaining and protecting and advancing the military-to-military relationship. One of the problems is that when you have a complicated relationship with a country like Egypt, one thing that becomes vulnerable sometimes is the mil-to-mil relationship. Politicians can differ, they can bicker, they can argue, which is very common. People on the military side like to protect their piece of that relationship and not make it subject to the bickering or the disputes among politicians. And I think this is a very deeply rooted understanding, both here in the U.S. side as well as throughout the Arab world and including Egypt. What needs to be done? I think there is a need to reshape the Egyptian-American relationship for the future, as if be reasonable and do it my way, or the issue of aid will be affected. People on the military side usually don't really like that to be used as a tool. And I think you can charter and craft a new relationship where you can protect that element. So it will not be a source of irritation, but will be a source of stability that can help rebuild some of the other relations that perhaps are not going well. The other thing is, I think you really need to start with Egypt a fresh start through a strategic dialogue. It is a very common tool that we have strategic dialogue with countries that are important to us, and we believe that we are important to them as well. The value of the strategic dialogue is to really clarify everything that you're concerned about, either the U.S. or that the Egyptians are concerned about. I think one of the values is when that dialogue starts, they should be very frank privately, but be very careful publicly. Sensitivity is too high on both sides, and the last thing you wanted to do as you are rebuilding a new or putting a new foundation for a relationship is to do it through the media. Egypt also has some responsibilities that I believe that they should pay attention to. As Egypt is trying to restore order and a pathway to an effective democracy, I think Egypt should define clearly to its people first and to its partners how political opposition have its needed space and protected rights. There is a serious concern that maybe there are some attempts, as you are taking, broad brush measures on security in order to establish order and stability, that you might harm some of the political rights. And optics in politics are really deadly. And I think the Egyptian government needs to make that very clear. What are the political rights? The worst possible thing that can happen is the appearance that there are attempts to criminalize political opposition. That would be really bad for Egypt, would be bad for the U.S., bad for everybody. You can and you should be in a position of political opposition. It exists everywhere. Nobody is inventing it, but it has to be done in a way that meets the needs and the requirements of the people and the nation where it is taking place. Egypt also really needs to do a better job in the final production and explanation of its decisions. Many of you basically refer to the court decisions about people. These are difficult even for Egyptians really to understand and figure out. And I was very intrigued by it. I had to really ask on one of my latest trips, and somebody explained to me that there is a difference between a verdict in a court and a court decision. A court decision is merely in an advisory capacity, and then when the people are in custody, then a whole new trial will start. But nonetheless, the final production of these decisions is very alarming for Egyptians as well as their partners. In conclusion, I believe that there are various conflicts taking place in that part of the world. They are all over the soul of the Arab nations. There are conflicts almost in more than 50% of the nations in that part of the world between radical forces and traditional societies. You see it in Egypt, you see it in Yemen, you see it in Tunisia, you see it in Syria, you see it in Iraq. These are just simply examples. I don't think one should be blinded, frankly, by looking at each country in an isolation of what's happening in the rest of the region. We in the U.S., we should not really make that mistake. Just look at Egypt and try to shape policies based on what's happening in Egypt. No, there is a region and there are some dynamics that are taking place in Egypt. And I think we should be aware of this. I think this is a second chance for Egyptian-American relationships. But for that relationship to move forward, I think both sides need really to work very hard at it. I believe that failure is not an option for Egypt or for the U.S., frankly. We should, I believe, swiftly seize this opportunity and have a very open and frank dialogue with the new Egyptian government once a new president is elected, once a new parliament is elected, in order to charter the future course of action. There are so many countries in that part of the world are pretty good candidates to be failed states. Don't forget, Somalia has been a failed state for 25 years now. Libya is a primary candidate, for example, to be a failed state. Others in the region. I don't think that it advances the U.S. interest at all to see Egypt going down that slippery slope of becoming a failed state. The old saying is, as Egypt goes, the region goes. Some people might argue this, might dispute it, but at the end of the day, a country with 90+ million people could do a lot of damage if it becomes a failed state. Sorry if I took so long. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Jim?
Thank you very much, Laura, and my thanks to the Security Project for doing this forum this afternoon. I think it's a great opportunity and very timely that we should be talking about the U.S.-Egypt strategic relations. I'm somewhat tempted after listening to my two predecessors speak here to throw out everything I was going to say and just say something terribly outrageous so that we can get some discussion going, but that wouldn't be exactly where I come from, so I'll try to maybe put a little bit of a different spin on it. As my friend Norm Coleman did in giving some of his disclaimer up front, I should add my own disclaimer, and that is that I'm on the board of both the International Republican Institute and of Freedom House. So I have a real interest in democracy, press freedom, human rights, political freedom, and those organizations have been very active in those countries, and our personnel have suffered in Egypt from being retained there. I think that this issue really, more than just about any I can think of, illustrates what I would call the web of conflicting American viewpoints and values. It's conflicting views and facts, and it highlights the U.S. ambivalence and the tension that always exists in this country between, on the one hand, our promoting democratic values, which we see as a core part of the DNA, I think, of Americans, and on the other hand, we clearly recognize with our role in the world, we have very serious strategic concerns in the world. And those are always in some kind of a tension, and I'll refer to that again and again here in my couple of minutes of remarks here. But I saw that very clearly in the 6 years that I chaired the Foreign Operations Subcommittee of the Appropriations in the House of Representatives. We're responsible for the funding, both of the military assistance package as well as the economic money that we would provide in assistance to Egypt. And you saw that conflict in the kind of aid we were giving. You saw the conflict in the kind of relationship we had and when we would meet with Egyptians and Egyptians would meet here in this country with us. Now, some would say that, Morsi came to power through elections, and that should be a defining moment for us. Well, we have a history of other countries where there have been elections and people have come to power and it hasn't turned out to be democratic. You can go back the better part of a century to the time that Adolf Hitler came to power in Germany through elections, and that certainly turned out horribly. More recently, in Venezuela, Chavez came to power through elections, but what happened was not the pursuit of democracy. So elections by themselves, I think most of us would recognize, certainly expressed, while important, and we believe that elections are important, an element of democracy, they are not in and of themselves the be-all and end-all that proves whether or not you have a democracy or not. Certainly, Morsi and the Muslim Brotherhood turned out not to be democratic. Their persecution of journalists, their detention of people, their tendency to rule by decree, the imposition of an Islamist constitution that was very sectarian, all of this turned out to be the antithesis of what I think many in Egypt thought they were getting at the time that this election took place. And certainly the revolt against Morsi, while ultimately it was the army that pushed him out, the revolt against him was clearly a very popular one. The direction that has taken place since then has not been to our liking in the way several things that have happened. The most notable and recent is the arrest and death sentences of literally hundreds of people without any kind of semblance of due process at all. And the obvious attempt to, which General Sisi has said himself, that there will be no sign of the Muslim Brotherhood as long as he is president of the country. Nonetheless, I think it is very important, as has already been pointed out by the two previous speakers, that we do have very significant strategic interests. Gamal pointed out, I think, 4 of them, and I just had noted pretty much the same ones myself. Keeping the Suez Canal secure is absolutely vital, not just for the United States, but for the world's commerce. Maintaining that peace treaty with Israel cannot be overestimated. I mean, 30 years of that has really led to freeing up at least one hand for the United States and the rest of the world in the Middle East has been extraordinarily important. More recently, the effort by the Egyptian military to pursue the jihadists in the Sinai and finally maintaining a good relationship with the United States is very, very important. Now, turning to the one hand and the other hand, which we keep talking about here, this ambivalence here. On the other hand, we do have core democratic values, and I don't think that the United States should be abandoning those. I don't think we should be writing them off. I don't think we should cease to talk about them, but we do have to balance them with our strategic interests. And if we look back at the recent history of the United States in the last half century, that has been the case for a long time. We have had many cases where we have examples where we have supported authoritarian regimes, Franco in Spain, all of which today are vibrant democracies. Now, I'm not saying it's because of our support of them as authoritarian governments that they turned out to be democracies, but I think it's important to note that there can be a transition. It may seem difficult to look at Egypt today and see how it's going to transform itself, but I think that should certainly be our goal, and we should understand that we have to balance these desires for democracy with the strategic interests that we have. So, what should be then the policy that the United States pursues? I think we should continue to support democracy in the Middle East, in Egypt, and around the world. We should work with the democratic elements in that country. We should work to help strengthen political parties, to build those political parties. We should work to help build a free press and a civil society there. We should speak out forcefully against detentions, against arrests and mass death sentences. But there may come a time when the withholding of assistance to Egypt actually can help nudge them toward democracy. And I think there have been some times that we saw that in the Mubarak regime where it did help to kind of push them, at least in one direction. I don't think at the moment that is the case. I do not think this government, this the military rule, is likely to be persuaded at all by anything that we would do that would withhold that assistance to them. There's no indication that they would change their views on that, and it could drive them further away from the United States. So all of this leads us to this, again, what I would call this ambivalence of, on the one hand, supporting democracy, on the other hand, supporting our strategic interests. I think, just in closing, I might just note that one of the commentators that has written about this at some length, Charles Krauthammer, put it this way. He said, what we have to think about is what's best for the United States and for Egypt, and what eventually might lead to a more democratic political system. With the Muslim Brotherhood, the possibility of that is zero. With the military, the possibility of that is slim. But slim trumps zero. And so that, I think, is where we are today.
That's certainly optimistic. I'm going to start off with a couple of questions. As a journalist, you know, I get irritated when the moderators of these things hog up all the time and all the questions, so I'm not going to do that. But I am going to start off with a couple of very quick ones, and I would like to remind our panel to try and give us some concise, short statements so we can move on and open it up to our distinguished audience here. I wanted to start with something that Gamal said. You know, we've all talked about why the U.S. should support Egypt, but I want to turn that on its head a little bit and say, does Egypt really need the United States stamp of approval as it moves forward? And if you all could talk a little bit about that. I mean, we've discussed what Egypt's interests are. They need strengthening in their economy, better, you know, their political system, their security. They need some help on that. But, you know, they are getting funding from other Arab nations. They're getting some help from Russia. Amr Moussa today expressed willingness to embrace any country that holds out a helping hand to Egypt at this point. So what are the risks to the U.S. if Egypt decides not to pursue an enduring, stable relationship with the United States? And can its people grow and prosper without Western aid and approval? You know, what is the absence? I guess in sum, what is the absence for U.S. WASTA or influencing the Mideast if Egypt does not embrace it? Secondly, just very quickly, I'd like you all to discuss a little bit about how much time you think General al-Sisi has to, if he does win an election, to win the hearts and the minds of the Egyptian people and to put the country on a stable path, whether it's democratic or not. Some people have suggested he has maybe a year or two. I wonder if you all think that he will serve out his first term if elected, and you know, if not, what will that mean for Egypt's role in the Mideast and the U.S. also role in the Mideast? Thanks.
Series of questions there. Let me respond to the last question first. The reality that General Sisi's issue, by the way, is not the path to democracy. It may be in our eyes. His issue is getting an economy going. when you may have, I've seen statistics saying, 12.5% unemployment in Egypt, but when you have 45% of the population under 30 and the unemployment population among youth over 25%, you've got a big problem. So winning the hearts and minds of the people of Egypt is first going to be about butter. It's not going to be about guns, and that's his biggest challenge. And Minister Musa will speak a little later, but he'll talk about that. He'll talk about things that need to be done internally within Egypt in terms of reforming government bureaucracy. How do you deal with the subsidies? A whole range of issues that we're not going to get into here. But his first issue is about the economy, about getting Egypt on a stable course. Second, there's great risk for the United States. We talked about why Egypt is important, its place in the region, the stability with Israel, the peace treaty, and the possibility, though I kind of discount the Russian piece, because I think the bonds that go between the U.S. and Egypt there are beyond the hardware piece. But I don't think it's to be ignored. But also, I think you got to recognize that the Gulf states can't carry the economic burden of Egypt alone forever. So Egypt needs us.
Although neither can the United States.
Right? No. But we need each other. And for those of us who believe that it's important that America lead, not from behind, there is greater consequence of not being involved. Of not having a stable ally in the Mideast who has been a source of stability, a word that's been used before, and so there would be great costs to the United States if somehow we thought it was too expensive to continue the relationship. If we and Jim, again, I serve on the board of the NED, a deep commitment which oversees the IRI, important issues to me. But understand that the path to democracy is a process. And my one reaction, we keep talking about this government. This is a government, and I was there not too long ago, and I met with ministers, and none of them said to me that they had to check with the military before they were doing their economic plan and their tourism plan. This is a government that said we're going to put together a group of 50, which His Excellency Musa led. They put together a constitution. Is it an American constitution? No, but it's a pretty good constitution. The military's got some, their presence is still going to be there, no doubt about that. But then said you were going to hold elections, and now elections are being held. So we're having the presidential election instead of the parliamentary election. So you can have an election. And I would urge Egyptians to get all the monitors in the world there. Let folks see, and I don't think you're going to be worried about stuffing ballots in that election. The fact is, it's pretty popular. The ultimate question you asked, which is one I don't know if any of us can answer, is how long does he have? And probably not a long window. But again, what his first priority is to get the economy of Egypt moving forward. And then, and it may have been Gamal's comment, optics and politics are deadly. You need to be concerned about the optics, because in order to have American support, these issues that my colleagues here talked about are important. As I said before, a Lindsey Graham and Ileana Ross-Leighton, they were major supporters of Egypt. Ileana said no way that the U.S. should recognize the Muslim Brotherhood. And for them to have concerns now tells you that these optics are important. They have to be dealt with. But internally for the general, Sisi, if he becomes a president, which I presume he's going to be, he's got to take care of his country's economy and at the same time be sensitive to the optics, because he's going to need the United States.
I think the short answer is yes. Egypt does need the United States, and I think for a variety of reasons that I have mentioned. When you go to Egypt now, perhaps the public sentiment, when you meet ordinary people, they will say, "Oh, hell with America! We can't stand America. They brought the Muslim Brotherhood," and they will give you a long list of things that they believe that the administration is responsible for. But when you actually talk with decision makers, policy people, people who are really seasoned, either in the military or politics or in the government, they do appreciate the relationship between Egypt and the United States. And by the way, this is not only limited to the either sort of like non-Islamist government. I think that when the Muslim Brotherhood was in power, they did work with the administration. Some people forget that there was an agreement between Hamas and Israel that was brokered then by previous President Morsi. It was really a simple agreement. You stop shooting, I stop shooting, and if we have a dispute, we go to Egypt and they will tell us who's at fault. But nonetheless, even for the Muslim Brotherhood government, the relationship with the United States was important. So I think regardless of who is going to be elected, I don't know. Most of you say Field Marshal Sisi. There's another candidate, I think Mr. Sabahi. But whoever that the Egyptian public will elect at the end of the day, that person, regardless of the rhetoric that they will say, they will realize once you are in a governing position, once you have the responsibility, you would look at countries differently. Now you have the luxury of flying rhetorics right and left, down with America, death to America, and all of that. In reality, I don't think this is going to work. In terms of how much time does if the new elected president will have, I really don't know. I think the Egyptian people also need to be a little bit realistic, because the public at large is very unrealistic. People think that they've had enough, and whoever is the next president will have to basically take them out of their misery in a matter of weeks or months. It's not going to happen.
Well, I would just say, I think what you've heard up here is, from all three of us, is that we recognize the shortcomings and failings of this government. There have been, in other cases in the past, shortcomings. It's easy to come down on the side that you do and say those shortcomings are so severe, there's no way that we can support it. I think some of us up here might come down and say, on balance, we think at the moment there is a need for that kind of support today.
Just before the Senator, if you allow me to just say a few words, I think I'm not here to represent anybody. I use with the U.S. government. The numbers that you just throw at us, I think they're a little bit too much. Hundreds of thousands killed. I don't think that. Well,
Hundreds and
I think that it is a little bit highly questionable. The issue here is there is a dispute between a certain group and the rest of the country. The idea is not pro or against Muslim Brotherhood or pro or against the Egyptian military. The point here is that the population needs to figure out a way to move forward. They felt, or portion of the population, they felt that Egypt's identity and Egypt's character was under assault, and therefore they were afraid of political Islam in general. Others, mainly young people right now, we see that they are afraid of the fact that the military will play a role in governing future Egypt. They see that as possible continuation of the last 60 years. There are certain things that the Egyptians themselves will have to sort out. The U.S. will have really very little to do with it. Putting aside the conspiracy theory and we are behind everything that happened in Egypt, the reality is the pathway is up to the Egyptians to determine. It's going to be a rocky road. It's not going to be easy by any stretch of imagination. And at the end of the day, it's still phase one, which Egypt becoming an emerging democracy. Thank you.
I don't know if we all have to answer every question. I'll just respond, and then maybe one of us will give an answer. But I do think it's important to say, you know, an overwhelming portion of the population felt that Egypt was being hijacked in a path that didn't want to take. When you get 30 million people signing a petition, it's pretty overwhelming. And then the second thing, just a personal observation, very quickly. When I was in Egypt, and I met with the Grand Mufti and the Coptic Pope, and what I found so fascinating is each talked about Egypt. They talked about Egypt, the 7,000 years, and the concern with the MB was that it wasn't about Egypt. It was about something kind of transnational, and I think that in part was one of the concerns of the people, that this kind of identity of Egypt. And so in the end, let the Egyptian people speak, and they will. There's going to be an election, and let's see what their voices say, and then we have to monitor that. We have to consider, we have to take into consideration all the things we have, but they're going to get a chance to speak pretty soon. And I think their voices are going to be the most important voices.
Okay, we only have a few more minutes left, so I'm going to do kind of some rapid-fire questions, ask our panelists to maybe one answer per panel so we can get to as many people as possible. And I would also ask the audience I'd ask them gently to please ask a question and not make a statement. This gentleman here, please.
Thank you for you, Laura, and everybody here. The credibility of the United States is really at stake. So long as we keep speaking on both hands and do nothing in the middle, our credibility is continuing to be in question Our integrity, in fact, is in question. I have heard a lot about our interests, their interests, but we are talking about government to government. I didn't hear the American people. I didn't hear the Egyptian people. Where do the interests of the American people, whose policy, whose foreign policy is managed despite their values, and where is the Egyptian people's interest, whose country is managed by the perceived interests of two nations, two militaries that are controlling on both sides?
Thank you. Who wants up?
Let me take a quick shot at this. I think you're absolutely right. Part of the problem that, although a solid, sort of like the appearance of a solid relationship between Egypt and the United States basically started in the 70s, right around the 73 war. That relationship, in my views, and I was inside the government, was really confined to a government-to-government relationship. The expansion of that relationship to really cover institutions and people and all of that did not mature in a way that, let's say, similar to the relationship between the United States and Israel, for example. Relationship that's deeply rooted, people, institutions, they are all in it. So should there be an expansion of that relationship and not keep it limited to the government on both sides? Absolutely.
Okay.